Hi everyone, I'm Simon Kilmurry. I'm the Executive Director of the International Documentary Association, and I am extremely happy to welcome Skye Fitzgerald, the Director of Hunger Ward, to this conversation. Skye, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great in this virtual world, but I'm so happy you're here, Simon.
Well, it's great. It's great to see you. This is such a powerful film. I want to start by asking, what was your inspiration to focus on Yemen and to focus specifically on the two on hunger and famine in children in this conflict that's been going on over there. What led you to the story?
Yeah, really, Hunger Ward is really a pretty organic continuation of the two films that came before it. So the trilogy really began as what I was hoping would be sort of a loose observation of how displacement is playing out differently in different parts of the world. And as it turns out, I did end up focusing primarily on the Middle East, but it didn't start that way conceptually. But it was the catalyst was, of course, the Syrian conflict, the Syrian uprising, and that's where I started. But because the numbers, they grew so rapidly, so quickly, and that eventually led me to Yemen simply because, um, it is a conflict that we are complicit in as Americans, with our government supporting the offensive operations there, but also because of the numbers. The I think it's a story that we don't hear enough about here in America, especially given our own country's involvement. Um, and I think it's really easy to be overcome by statistics, by the numbers that we hear that X thousand number of children are suffering from near famine is the term that the UN uses. Well, we become sort of numbed to those over time. But I had enough friends in the region and enough um, pictures and colleagues going in and out who shared stories with me. And, these are human beings, right? These are our friends, these are our colleagues. And I felt like it was really vital that we try to, as a filmmaking team, come up with sort of a cinematic observation of it rather than just a journalist popping in for a day or two to do a news story, because that's a different, that's a different thing than what we want to try to do. So um, it's just something that I really believed we needed to explore, and I felt it was the perfect capstone for the trilogy.
I want to come back to the trilogy in a little bit and look at the Hunger Ward within that broader context. But let's pick up on some of the things you were saying. You I think coined a term which I find really interesting, and it's humanitarian cinema, which I read somewhere that you use that phrase, and I think what's one of the things that is incredibly striking about Hunger Ward in particular is you're very restrained in the geopolitics in explaining the conflict. We have a little bit at the beginning. We have the funeral missile strike scene, and then there's a little bit at the end. Talk about your approach to storytelling within that kind of humanitarian cinema construct.
Yeah, I guess I come from the cohort within the documentary field that really just believes deeply in the principle that cinema is primarily a visual medium, right? And that my goal is always try to tell a story visually as fully as I can, right? And that goes for the contextual piece of it as well. So, I'm not a filmmaker who's interested in putting a lot of cards up or having a narrator or clobbering an audience over the head with statistics, because I think part of that sort of humanitarian cinema principle that I allow to guide me is that um, a film can be an empathy machine. It can be a driver of understanding and empathy on a deep human level. And that if we can achieve that as filmmakers, then it has all these other sort of ancillary effects, right? Then it can sort of move from the heart to the head to the intellect, right? And then if we pose enough questions of the heart, right? If we want people to understand why a child can weigh 24 pounds when they're 10 years old, then people will want to know the answers, and hopefully that will catalyze them as human beings to engage on the issue more fully. So I like to do that visually, hopefully with the idea that an immersive visual storytelling will motivate people to want to know more.
Well, let's talk about the heart of the film. We have this story that we're following primarily two strands. We have Dr. Aida Al-Sadiq in Aden, and we have Nurse Mekia Madi in northern Yemen, along with the two young girls, Abir, who's 6 years old, weighs only 15 pounds, and Omima, who is, as you mentioned, 10 years old and weighs only 24 pounds. What was your entry point into connecting with Dr. Al-Sadiq? Let's start with her. She's the first primary connection into the story.
Yeah, Dr. Al-Sadiq is really sort of the primary specialist for pediatric malnutrition in the entire country of Yemen. And she's become widely known throughout the Middle East as well for her sort of deep work on the issue. And she also serves as a professor of pediatric malnutrition at the University of Aden in the south of the country. So she really is a specialist. And so her name, as I started to do due diligence on the project and started to really research and learn, how did these two clinics, this clinic and this hospital, how did they stay afloat in the midst of a conflict, of an armed conflict? Who was driving the fact that these two institutions were incredibly successful in the middle of a war in saving so many children? And these two women emerged over and over again, Dr. Al-Sadiq and Mekia Madi. And so I reached out, and I reached out through colleagues who live in Yemen, as well as colleagues who had worked extensively in the country. And we started a dialogue with her, initially via email, and then that translated eventually to WhatsApp. And we started talking and communicating. And just the more that we communicated, the more I just believed that she was the perfect sort of conduit for the story, because she was in the ward every day, right? She was in the ward treating these children every day, and she'd been doing it for 13 years. So she had sort of a linear perspective on what malnutrition was in the country pre-war, and then also during the war. And she could speak to how the war had affected and catalyzed the famine that Yemen is currently undergoing. So it was a long-term building of relationship long before we went.
And when did Omina enter into your filming process?
Yeah, the entry of Omima into sort of our observational storytelling with her really was, it was just based on two factors. One, who was admitted to that hospital while we were there, right? And then which of those patients were willing to collaborate with us as a film team, because that was something we were very careful about with the families and with the patients, and not everyone wanted to, right? And so we were very careful to have long conversations with families who were currently in the clinic to determine who was interested and who wasn't. And she just happened to be admitted immediately prior to when we landed in Aden. So she'd already been admitted, and her case was so extreme, right? And she was such a beautiful young girl who was suffering such a tragedy of circumstance that when we talked to her family and we talked to her and she was willing to work with us, we just thought what a beautiful way to show people that here's a 10-year-old that in almost any other country in the world, right, would be in a completely different circumstance, but by virtue of where she was born and when she was born, she's facing this horrible disease that she may not recover from. And we thought there was real sort of a deep value to that, to allowing her to sort of show her interactions with Aida as she was diagnosed and then treated, but also allowing an audience into her world and by just being there during her treatment.
Mhm. Um, I want to ask what it was like for you and your DP Jeffrey Ball and the rest of the team. It was primarily just the two of you, right? And with a Yemeni fixer. How big was your crew?
Yeah. This I used the same model on this film as I did with the previous two. So on Lifeboat, there was just two of us.
Hmm.
And my philosophy from a filmmaking standpoint is, I really wanted to make this as immersive and intimate as possible. And that was partly because Yemen is a dangerous place, right?
Yeah.
And being out in the open is in a country in the middle of armed conflict is inherently dangerous. So we wanted to mitigate risk. But beyond that, it's a notoriously difficult place to film. Full stop. Just to get into the country is very, very difficult, and it's difficult for the journalists and the filmmakers who are already there. And so this very narrow crack we were able to find our way through was I was able to secure initially only one visa with permission to film, and then later two visas. So I knew we could only get two people into the country for a limited amount of time. And on all these projects, my production paradigm has been to have two DPs in the field because we're so small, right? And I felt like a boom pole would be too imposing and it would break up the scene. So we didn't want a boom pole. We just wanted two cameras rolling as much as possible, and then one field producer. And that field producer, by necessity and by request, really needed to be very not the public facing piece of the project because of the danger to them. So there were two of us filming for the entire project, and then we had a Yemeni field producer working with us the entire time as well. So it was a very, very small team, and we had a limited time as well because they would only issue a visa for 30 days. And in previous circumstances, when filmmakers or journalists had tried to overstay those, they were immediately either jailed or kicked out of the country immediately. So we knew we had this very limited window as well. And so that sort of really shaped how we filmed, right? Where we really dedicated almost all of our waking hours to actually being in the clinic and the hospital to observe what was happening and unfolding.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's go to northern Yemen
Yeah.
if we can to the Aslam clinic with nurse Mickey Amati. What was your entree into? That's a very different place, very different part of Yemen. We know the conflict is really dividing this country. How did you get access into that clinic?
Yeah, very carefully. It was once again, it was an incredible amount of due diligence beforehand, where we were simul-tracking permission, because the Hadi government, is the globally recognized government, of course, of the South, but they only control, a very small percentage of the country, 20 to 30%, maybe less today with the current offensive going on. So we had a simultaneous conversation going on with Ansar Allah, with the Houthi rebel group, to secure their own versioning of permission to access the north of the country. And even though they're not a globally recognized government, if you follow Yemen at all, they are absolutely serving the function of a de facto government. And they have much more control of the country than the government of the South does in the South. And so it was actually an equally rigorous process to work through our field producer in the north to submit paperwork over and over again and explain over and over again exactly what we were trying to do, and that this was, again, humanitarian cinema, right, which is trying to show the effects of the war on civilians in particular. Once we had that permission, the physically getting there was a whole nother challenge. It was very delicate. The road from the south to the north, the primary road, changes sometimes on a daily basis because of where the fronts are. And we went through probably 25 checkpoints on that day alone, where we had to show our paperwork from the north that we had permission to go through that particular checkpoint. So that was just to get into the Houthi-held area. And then to work our way to Makia's clinic was a whole nother several days of travel. The the good news is that we've been in really consistent contact with Nakia beforehand, and had that relationship waiting once we got there. But the getting there was one of the biggest challenges of the project, frankly.
Mhm. With Nurse Makia, and we meet Abir, the young girl who's 6 years old and only weighs 15 pounds, and there's a moment kind of later in her story which is incredibly heartbreaking when we find out that she's actually developed a wheat allergy, a reaction to wheat, a serious one, because that is all the kids get through the aid system. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I thought that was incredibly revealing.
Yeah, that, this is one of those discoveries that you make when you're shooting a film sometimes, right? I mean, I heard a Q&A a month or so ago, where I forget who it was, so I wish I could cite them, but they had this beautiful quote about how, God is the director on documentaries, right? So whoever said that, thank you. You may know who originally said that.
I think it was Al Maisels who said it originally, but
Yeah, but that really resonated with me for Hunger Ward, right? Because it was a situation where there was only so much we could do beforehand, and then we constantly made these discoveries, like you just noted, where, oh my God, here's this young child suffering this horrible condition, and it's ironically in part because she is getting aid, but she doesn't have a broad spectrum diet, right? Because of the war, right? Because of the inflation caused by the war, but also because access to a full spectrum diet just isn't available in northern Yemen right now because of deep poverty caused by the war, but also because of aid shipments. The food gets held up at checkpoints, right? And for bribes sometime as well. So by the time that aid food shipments actually get to where she is, the only thing that's still good sometimes is wheat products, right? And if a child eats a very narrow diet, narrow spectrum diet of just gluten-based products over time, they're much more likely to develop something like a gluten intolerance, right? And that was literally killing her.
mm-hmm.
And we had no idea that that was sort of a growing set of, I mean, that incidence of children developing is really it's happening on a relatively regular basis now in Yemen because access to a broad spectrum diet is so limited because of the war. So it was something we discovered, and strangely, two of our film collaborators, both Omima and Abir, by chance were victims of that circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was one of those revelatory moments where you think the aid is there to help people survive, but yet even the aid is killing them too.
Yeah.
So give us a sense of, you noted earlier how kind of underreported, undercovered this conflict has been in the US in particular, and yet we are complicit in this, providing aid to the Saudis. Um, can you kind of unpack, what is this conflict about? Because I think most people here actually don't really understand what's going on there.
Yeah, and it's a conflict that is complex, and it's often overly simplified in the media, especially in the Western world. I think just to try to sort of wrap your head around it. And the reality is, no one in this conflict really has clean hands. There's blood on everybody's hands who's involved in it. But in short, it goes back many generations, to the fear, that longstanding fear and animosity between Sunni Saudi Arabia, right, who shares a border with northern Yemen, and the Shiites of northern Yemen, in particular Ansar Allah. And so after the Arab Spring, when a new government was installed in Yemen, Saudi Arabia decided that because the Shiite rebels, Houthis, had taken control of northern Yemen, that was just too close for comfort, that they were controlling too much of the country that shared Saudi Arabia's southern border. So they decided to basically invade via an air campaign. And they went in thinking that a quick air campaign would bomb the Houthis out of existence. It'd be a quick and easy air campaign, and then they could install sort of a Saudi-backed government in Yemen so their border would be secure. Well, it didn't turn out that way at all, of course, and they enlisted the U.S. government's support to provide targeting information as well as operational support to this air campaign, which has just been devastating to the people of Yemen, and has resulted in just hundreds of war crimes, frankly. And Human Rights Watch has a bunch of reports on this, as well as Mawatana. And so it's been a long-standing, mostly air campaign against the Houthis of the north that has mostly devastated the civilian infrastructure of the country, and has been sort of a driver of a further dissembling of control in the country, throughout the country. And so the big push has been, UAE also got involved. The thing that has been most devastating to the country has been the air and sea blockade that the Saudi-led coalition has put into place. So they have closed down the primary airport of the north, which prevents foodstuffs, medicine, and doctors from coming in. And there's a port, Hodeidah, in the west of the country, which is the primary northern port that they have prevented, because it's a contested port with the Houthis, for food supplies from coming in as well. That, combined with financial sanctions, which have caused inflation to spike, have just put foodstuffs out of reach for your average Yemeni, and has brought the population, at least 80% of the population, to near famine.
And you have a campaign also that you're running in conjunction with the film right now, how people can get involved and how people can support different organizations that are working with these institutions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've been, one of the motivations for the film was again, like I said earlier, to try to activate change, right? Because this is a war that has been caused, and a famine that's been caused, by people. We can end it through action as well. And so we're working very closely with the Friends Committee for National Legislation in DC. We're working very closely with the Yemen Alliance Committee, as well as the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, which are 3 key organizations listed on our website, which are all working on different pieces of this. So there's a legislative push to convince the Biden administration to reverse course. And we've been just super pleased to see that in his first major press announcement, he has reversed course. And we've been a part of that movement. We can't take credit for it, but we have been a very active piece of that. We've done screenings of the film that then bring in specialists to sort of talk about what can be done. A reversal of the foreign terrorist organization of the Houthi is also a really key piece of this, because it was really blocking humanitarian aid to the north. So we're really happy that these organizations we're partnering with through film screenings and other efforts are actually having a great deal of success at the moment, and we're 110% in on that effort.
Yeah, no, I saw the news about the change of policy around the Houthi designation, which I think most people really kind of misunderstood what that meant, in terms of, the terrorist designation was actually really about, blocking any kind of humanitarian aid getting into helping those people.
Yeah.
Let's step back and kind of look at talk about the film within kind of the broader context of the trilogy. I mean, first of all 3 films, 50 Feet from Syria, Lifeboat, and Hunger Ward, they're aesthetically, they're stunningly beautiful films. You have a very particular approach, and I'm curious, how do you go about kind of conceiving how you're going to visually capture this stuff? Because none of this stuff is easy. It's all hard. It's all hard to watch, but yet you have to make aesthetic and story choices as a filmmaker, with your editor Dan Sadowski. Where how much you show the audience, and those are difficult choices to make. But talk about how the three films build on each other and your kind of storytelling approaches to each of them.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I think about a lot, right? Because it is, you know, each of these has been difficult content, right? But again, back to sort of like just some of the ideas that I tussle with as a filmmaker. You know, I guess I've always believed, Simon, that, you know, it's it's important for us to look at the hard stuff, right?
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
important for us to not to turn away, to sort of through our work, I try to bear witness. And I think part of that for me personally is to not flinch. That you know, I think if we turn away from the hard stuff, then I don't think we're doing it justice. And for me personally, I don't think I'm honoring those who have agreed to work with me if I'm not willing to show the hard moments. And so the way I like to think of it is that you know, um, if you can find the beauty in a scene, or if you can find the dignity in a scene, and then you can just use the principles of good filmmaking, of good composition, right? Of a beautiful act of a child giving water, right, to a younger child, which we
Yeah,
found in the film, and
yeah.
seek those out in the edit, right? Then I think if we foreground the beauty, both through craftsmanship, but also through content, right? The beauty of Dr. Al Sadiq, of really, after a child dies, in the room talking with Salha, her staff, to be really honest about, this child shouldn't have died. She was in our care, and even though we did everything we could, it's on me, right? It's on her to understand that and own it. That's such an intimate moment, right? But to me, it's beautiful because it shows how this beautiful woman who's working so hard day in and day out to try to do the simplest and most fundamental thing, save a child from starvation, but she's being vulnerable doing it. To me, that has beauty in it. So that's sort of one of the principles that I always follow, is where, even if it's something hard, even if it's the death of someone, how can you tease out the dignity in it? How can you choose to find the beauty in it somehow, both through how you film it, but then how you craft it in the edit?
Yeah, and the film, and I think your work overall is full of these small gestures. Um, um, you know, you talked about the young girl giving the cup of water, the capful of water to the little boy. You know, you have Nurse Mekia, just in the way she holds, you know, Abir's hand and touches her face and says, you know, tries to coax a smile out of her. Um, uh, the look in Dr. Al Sadiq's eyes after the little one dies, and her grandmother is in grief of looking for just someone, some system to blame. These are there are all these moments of incredible power, and I think that's something that runs through your work, is that I've observed, is just an, you know, but also people retaining their dignity, their humanity, their and those moments highlight their humanity.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that that stuck with you, because it is something that I care a lot about, right? You know, when someone invites you into their life in this way, right? Um, then there's to me there's an incredible responsibility inherent in that, right? And the last thing I want to do is cover this very difficult moment in their life in a way that they wouldn't want me to, frankly, because they're really vulnerable moments, right? And I think that's why we go in with just two people, right? Because two people can develop those relationships over time if you're there long enough. And you know, it's why I try whenever I can to say their names, you know, to say the names of those who have passed, Asila and Dala and Takana, these children who didn't have to die, who passed because of this horrible conflict that we can do something about as Americans. And you know, Simon, that's what I wake up with every morning. You know, this is what motivates me as a filmmaker, is I do, you know, whether it's accurate or not, I still believe that we can really do something with cinema that moves people, but moves people to change, right? That moves people to engage. And that's what we're trying to do with this film, right? We're trying to get people to pay attention, but more than that, to pay attention and then say, wow, my tax dollars are
Hmm.
going towards this bomb, which just dropped in Sana in the north of the country. You
Hmm.
know, bull. I don't want them to go there, and we can do something about it. So that's how I always sort of set these films out to is can we intervene in some meaningful way if we do this well,
Hmm.
and that's our hope with this film as well.
Hmm. Thank you. So before we wrap up, Skye, I need to ask if you have any updates on Omina, on Abir, and the work of Dr. Al Sadiq and Nurse Maddie.
Yeah, Makia in the north continues to do her work as she always has, right? I mean, she was fundamental to the creation of that clinic, the Aslam clinic, and I think she'll probably will until the day she passes, right? So that work goes on. There's been some challenges in the north in the past several months with the price of diesel being so high that transportation has become a real issue for her to send out her envoys, which often collect children from villages who need help who can't reach the clinic, and then also the cost for those village children to actually reach her clinic. So that's been a challenge, but she continues to do the work. Abir in the north, I'm happy to report, is just thriving.
Mm.
We've received some photos back from Makia that are just she looks like a completely different girl. Her arms have completely filled out. She's physically thriving, and the latest we heard from Makia is that the stunting that she was experiencing as a 6-year-old is probably not going to be as extreme as they initially thought if she continues on the current diet she's on. So it's really wonderful news. In the south, there's been a little bit of change. Dr. Al Sadiq, after 13 years at the Saraka Hospital, has sort of pivoted, and so she's no longer the key pediatrician there. I think it really has been wearing on her. She's been doing it for so long. So she pivoted into her second job, which is she's training. She's as the pediatric specialist in the country. She's training all the up and coming medical students and doing rounds in the hospital with the medical students who want to become pediatric specialists. So she's still in the hospital doing rounds, but in the role of a professor. She's not actively treating the patients. Omema has also really transformed. She also has sort of like thrived under this new diet and some medicine that Dr. Al Sadiq prescribed. And the last photo I got of her personally, I almost didn't recognize her. Her cheeks were completely filled out. She had this huge smile on her face, and I swear she probably grew 2 or 3 inches. So she's also thriving. So that gives me hope, right? That we can't necessarily solve world hunger, right? But you know what? This child is healthier, and this child is healthier, and I'm confident knowing that both Makia and Aida are going to have more success stories like that, and continue to.
Mhm. Well, that's a great note to wrap this up on, Skye. I'm so happy to hear that both Amima and Abi are thriving, and you're right. They're stand-ins for so many other kids who are suffering, who we could help if we just made a different decision to do so.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for the film, for all your work, and your team also. I think I got to commend Jeffrey Ball and Dan Sadowski for the work they've done with you, and congratulations on making a beautiful film.
Simon, thank you so much. It's really an honor to speak with you.
Great.
Okay, take care.